Texas is known not only for its deserts, swamps, and canyons, but also for a series of mysterious disappearances of people under completely normal circumstances. Experienced travelers and ordinary vacationers disappear in the state's national parks and popular tourist areas. They vanish suddenly and without a trace, sometimes right in front of their friends and loved ones. Despite extensive searches involving rescue teams, dogs, and helicopters, there are still no answers to these mysterious cases. Today, you will hear 3 stories that remain disturbing reminders of how quickly and inexplicably a person can disappear, even in well-known places. Before the video starts, I want to remind you that your support is very important, so don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Sam Harris, a 32-year-old man who loved fishing and hiking, disappeared on a hot June day in 1994 on Lake Caddo. The place itself was considered not only picturesque, but also somewhat mysterious. Lake Caddo is overgrown with cypress trees and surrounded by dense, marshy banks where moss and vines hang from twisted branches. The entire landscape sometimes looks like a scene from a movie about mystical swamps. It was this atmosphere that attracted Sam, who loved secluded spots where he could cast his line in peace, listen to the cries of herons, and forget about the noise of the big city. According to his friends Tom and Nick, who had accompanied Sam to the lake, the whole trip was planned as a short 2-day fishing trip without any frills. They stopped at a small, dilapidated pier on the western shore of the lake, where an old house, once used for boat rentals, now stood empty. Locals often fished in the area, knowing that you could catch some good perch and catfish there. On that day, around June 12, 1994, the 3 friends set about their usual business early in the morning, setting up their gear, arranging their chairs, and enjoying the silence. The weather was humid, with the sun peeking through storm clouds that promised possible precipitation. Tom recalled that Sam had seemed excited since morning, constantly talking about a spot where he thought the fishing would be good. Nick, a little tired from the road, jokingly waved him off, asking him to give him some time to get settled. By lunchtime, the friends had caught a few small fish, nothing serious, but everyone was still in high spirits. Sam, as usual, was brimming with ideas. "Let's move a little further down the shore. There are fewer people there and the fish are more cautious," he suggested. "Maybe we can cast our lines under a snag for the evening bite." But his friends were in no hurry to change locations. According to Nick, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the 3 of them were sitting on folding chairs at the water's edge, chatting about the latest game of their favorite baseball team. The hot, humid air permeated everything around them. At one point, Sam suddenly said he wanted to fill a bottle with some lake water to wet his bait and rinse his hands. It didn't seem unusual. The water was nearby, just a few feet away. He took off his cap, placed it next to his chair, stood up with his fishing rod in one hand, or, according to another version, he left the rod but took the empty bottle, and walked over to the water. According to recollections, it was literally 15 or 16 feet away. "I saw him bend over the water, then look away," Tom said. "Maybe I glanced at the float, which had started to bob." Nick claimed that at that very moment he was looking for something in his bag. The point is that both of them lost sight of Sam for a split second. 2 minutes passed, and the friends looked around. Sam was gone. At first they weren't alarmed, deciding that he might have walked a little further along the shore. Walking along the edge of the lake past the low bushes, they didn't find him or even see any traces of him. It all seemed strange. Could Sam have left without warning? They searched the nearest bushes and started calling loudly. 10 minutes later, they were worried. They called Sam, but there was no answer. No splashes. His friends became alarmed and quickly walked to the old pier to see if he had gone there for some equipment, but it was empty. They asked a couple of fishermen nearby who shrugged. "We didn't see anyone, just the 3 of you fishing." Gradually, they realized that Sam had essentially disappeared in a matter of minutes, in clear weather, without a sound or a struggle. Nick ran to the car to get to the nearest village and call the rescue service. By evening, county police officers, local volunteers, and then officers from the hunting and fishing department arrived at the scene. Everyone began searching the coastal thickets, looking under driftwood and in the shallow water. There were no signs of a fallen man, no clothing or traces of a struggle. Tom and Nick swore that Sam had not mentioned anything about wanting to leave the shore, and there was no reason for him to go far. All his belongings, including his wallet, were still in his bag. Hours passed, but the missing man was not found. At 2 in the morning, the active search had to be suspended until morning. Darkness, swamp, and dense trees made the search dangerous. At dawn, new volunteers arrived. Dogs, which were given Sam's shirt to sniff, it was lying in the car as a spare, ran along the shore, at first seeming to pick up a scent, but it broke off just at the water's edge, not far from where he had been standing, leaning over the water. Did that mean Sam had gone into the water and drowned? But then there should have been traces. Not to mention that the body could have floated up. And the lake, though treacherous, was not that deep in the coastal zone. Divers checked this part of the bottom and found nothing but bottom algae and a few old cans. There was no body underwater, which puzzled the rescuers. As the days passed, people searched more and more extensively. After 2 days, volunteers brought in boats with echo sounders to explore deeper parts of the lake, but to no avail. They theorized that Sam might have been attacked by an alligator. Alligators were said to inhabit some parts of Lake Caddo, but there was no evidence to support this. Usually such an attack would leave traces of a struggle or torn clothing and blood. However, nothing was found. Skeptics were more likely to say maybe he swam away or drowned somewhere else and was carried away by the current, but the current in Lake Caddo is not that strong, and some of the items would have floated to the surface anyway. Nothing was found in the water. On the 5th and 6th days of fruitless searches, the rescue command began to wind down the active phase. We've tried everything. It looks like the man disappeared in a matter of seconds, and we have no leads on where to go next. Sam's parents, upon learning of the tragedy, rushed from another state and begged for the search to continue. But resources were limited, and day after day the search yielded no results. In the middle of the following week, on the 7th day after his disappearance, the search operation was officially called off. The police filed a missing person report, and the case was added to the archives. Tom and Nick were squeezed like lemons. They felt guilty for not keeping track of their friend and sincerely did not understand what could have happened. But the most incredible fact emerged a month later, when the story of Sam's disappearance was no longer on the front pages of local newspapers. On a Friday evening, July 15th or 16th, at the same old pier, where no one usually fished because it was dilapidated and dangerous, a woman walking along the shore noticed several items of fishing tackle. Looking closer, she realized that there was a fishing rod, a reel, a set of hooks, and a small box of bait, as if someone had just left them there. Remembering the recent disappearance of the fisherman, the woman called the police. Within an hour, officers arrived at the scene and discovered that the gear belonged to the missing Sam. Tom and Nick identified it by the distinctive markings Sam had made on his reel and bait box. Not only that, but his friends swore that the pier had been searched 7 times by people, including themselves, in the first week after his disappearance. Volunteers literally tapped the boards and looked under the decking, but there were definitely no fishing rods there. How did they suddenly appear in plain sight? They weren't hidden in any shelter, but seemed to have been deliberately placed at the edge of the pier so that passers-by could see them. The police conducted another local search, suspecting that someone might have decided to play a cruel joke, or that Sam's body was somewhere nearby, but to no avail. No footprints or new clues were found nearby. The pier itself had been checked several times before, so the theory that the gear had been lying there unnoticed for a month seemed unlikely. However, the official report stated, unidentified persons may have moved the missing person's fishing equipment for unknown reasons. The missing man's friends, who were more inclined to believe in the supernatural, decided that this was a case of someone deliberately planting the items to raise more questions. In the end, this did not help find Sam. His body never surfaced, and no one reported seeing him. All traces ended after 7 days of searching and this strange discovery of fishing gear in mid-July. The police officially stated, "We have no reason to believe that his death was violent, but we also have no evidence that he is alive. If he had simply drowned, what prevented the water from carrying his body away? Rational commentators point out that someone could have found these items in the bushes without realizing what they were, and simply left them on the pier, hoping that the owner would return. Or someone could have deliberately played a game by planting the evidence. However, if that's the case, why didn't anyone report the find immediately? And how did these items remain so intact after a month of rain and heat? Sam Harris's family moved out of the state a few years after the tragedy, unable to bear the pain of constantly seeing Caddo Lake, where mystery enthusiasts periodically returned. Palo Duro Canyon, located in northwestern Texas, is considered the second largest canyon in the United States for good reason. In the middle of the summer of 1997, its scorching rock formations, bizarre layers of red sandstone, and endless expanses were bathed in the midday sun. The canyon's hiking trails attracted travelers with their epic beauty. Among those who decided to take the popular route that July day were 39-year-old Jack Everett and his wife Emily. Their car was parked in the visitor area around 9 a.m. on July 15, 1997, when the heat had not yet taken over, and the air was still tolerable. They planned a typical day hike without any extra baggage. A couple of liters of water for the two of them, some light snacks, a camera, and a sense of joyful anticipation. According to Emily, everything was going smoothly. They walked at a leisurely pace, exchanging joking remarks about the bright colors of the canyon walls. The landscape around them breathed a sultry calm, and they encountered a few other tourists on the narrow trail, all in the mood to see and photograph. As they walked side by side, there was no hint of danger, but the high spirits quickly turned to gloom when, at about 11 o'clock, Jack stopped to tie his shoelaces. The trail ran along a small ledge that sloped slightly upward. Emily said to him, "I'll go ahead and see where the trail leads. Catch up." He nodded. It seemed like Jack would be ready to continue in a matter of seconds. Emily walked about 70 feet along the narrow path, looked around, turned back, and realized that her husband was nowhere to be seen. It all happened in a matter of moments. One moment she saw him standing over his shoes. The next moment there was nothing but empty space. At first she decided that Jack might have decided to take a side path. She called out loudly, "Jack, where are you?" But there was no answer. Returning to where he had been sitting, Emily found no one. She patiently walked around the bushes and peered down the path, but there was no sign of anyone. From the very first moment, she suspected something was wrong. This couldn't be a simple case of him falling behind. There was no reason for Jack to go off in the other direction without saying anything. Fearing that he might have slipped and fallen, Emily ran down the slope toward the dry riverbed, looking down the embankment. Silence, no cries, no rustling. After a few minutes, realizing that the situation was critical, she returned to the beginning of the trail and reported the disappearance to the rangers in the visitor area. They responded quickly. Within an hour, they organized an initial search and questioned other tourists. They asked random people, "Have you seen a man in a white t-shirt and shorts, 39 years old?" Everyone shrugged. At first, they decided that he might have taken the wrong trail and was looking for his wife. But time passed, and Jack did not appear. In the afternoon, dog handlers, local volunteers, and the county police joined the search. It was clear that Palo Duro Canyon did not have any impassable forests, but there were many ledges, cliffs, and rock shelters. In summer, the heat can be deadly if a person does not have enough water. The police questioned Emily. Were there any conflicts? Any reasons for her husband to leave? She shook her head. No, everything was fine. He was just tying his shoelaces. We were only a few feet apart. None of the passing tourists could remember seeing Jack after that moment. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The search dragged on for a week. A couple of helicopters were called in to fly over key areas of the canyon, including sheer walls and narrow paths. They searched ravines and dry riverbeds, looking for scraps of clothing that might have caught on bushes, but found nothing. The dog sniffed Jack's belongings, picked up a scent on the trail, and then lost it after a sharp turn behind a rock ledge. The absence of even the slightest noise or cries for help added to the confusion of the rescuers and the family's friends. The rangers came up with theories. Maybe he fell and suffered a serious head injury, then slid down somewhere and couldn't call for help. But in that case, there would have been at least something. A week passed without a single clue. Finally, the official search was called off, with the county authorities stating, "We have combed the area and deployed air and ground forces. No traces or clues have been found. Mr. Everett is listed as missing." Emily was devastated, but she continued to hope. He has to be somewhere, alive or dead. He can't just vanish into thin air. She hired private investigators several times and offered a reward for any information, but to no avail. In late autumn, when the heat subsided and new volunteers arrived, another search was conducted, also without success. It seemed that the story of Jack Everett would become another unexplained disappearance, destined to sink into the archives. But in the winter of that year, rumors began to circulate that someone had seen a shadow resembling a male figure wandering along the steep slope at night. Of course, this was never confirmed. It was only 6 months later that a development occurred which, instead of providing answers, raised even more questions. In January 1998, tourists who had decided to take an unusual route for photography accidentally stumbled upon a human skull at the foot of a rocky ledge. According to them, the site was in one of the areas where searchers had been several times in the early days of the operation. The police confirmed, yes, it is a human skull, and one of a distinctive shape which, according to dental records, belonged to Jack Everett. There were no other bones, fragments of clothing, or personal belongings around it. Just the skull lying on the surface with no traces of dirt or obvious decomposition nearby. In other words, it would have been difficult not to notice it during the previous search, as the area had already been searched. Nevertheless, all those who had participated in previous searches swore that they had not seen any remains. So how did the skull end up there? Could animals have moved the remains? It is possible, but in that case, other bones are usually found nearby, within a radius of several dozen feet. Nothing of the sort was found. A forensic examination was unable to determine the cause of death from the skull. There were no obvious signs of gunshot wounds, fractures, or anything similar. The teeth more or less matched Jack's records, as his dentist confirmed some unique fillings. The rest of the skeleton was gone, along with his clothes and backpack. The police took statements from a couple of tourists who found the skull. They claimed that they were walking along a trail at the foot of the cliff, where the search had already taken place, when they suddenly saw something white on the rocks. That was all. In the end, county officers issued a formal resolution. In the absence of other evidence and signs of violent death, the case is not classified as suspicious. The cause of death has not been determined. The body was found partially intact, and DNA or dental evidence confirmed that it was Mr. Jack Everett. Questions surrounding the death remain open, but there will be no criminal investigation. For Emily, this moment was a heavy relief. At least she knew her husband was dead and was able to hold a symbolic farewell ceremony. However, too many questions remained. Why did no one notice his body, and how did his skull float up where people were already walking? Why were no other parts of the skeleton preserved? In any case, the story of July 15, 1997, when 39-year-old Jack Everett stepped away to tie his shoelaces and his wife walked ahead of him for just a moment, remains one of the most terrifying mysteries of Palo Duro Canyon. No scream, no sound, no struggle. People were walking along the trail, the sun was high in the sky, the wind was gently rustling the bushes, and suddenly a man was gone, as if a secret door to reality had opened. Since then, local rescuers have been debating the case. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't find a single clue for a week. And 6 months later, the skull was found almost in plain sight. As a result, the police closed the case as an accident with unknown circumstances. But for the family, friends, searchers, and those interested in mysterious disappearances, it remains an unsolved tragedy, one that could easily be added to the long list of unexplained cases in American parks and canyons. In March 2001, a mysterious disappearance occurred in Big Bend National Park in southwestern Texas, which is still discussed by hiking enthusiasts and unofficially classified as a missing 411 story. 28-year-old Amanda Fields, who had come to the park with a group of friends for a long weekend, disappeared in a matter of moments during a leisurely hike along the Lost Mine Trail, one of the most famous and popular trails in the local tourist community. According to her friends, the trip was spontaneous. Early March is usually dry season in Texas, and the weather promised a warm, clear day with no surprises. Amanda and her friends, 5 people in total, arrived at the park early in the morning and parked at the start of the Lost Mine Trail, popular for its magnificent views of the mountain ranges. According to friends, the trail itself was not considered dangerous or physically demanding. It was about 5 miles long, with a moderate elevation gain, and many hikers, including seniors and families, easily completed it in a few hours. The group brought water and light snacks and planned to return to Terlingua in the afternoon to spend the night at a campground. Along the way, Amanda kept up cheerfully, stopping occasionally to take pictures of the scenery. She was an avid amateur photographer and tried to capture the midday sun shining on the rocky outcrops from the best angle. Soon, the group reached one of the key vantage points, where many people stopped to admire the valley and take memorable photos. There were indeed quite a few tourists around, the weather was unusually good, and the Lost Mine Trail is not usually deserted at this time of year. According to her friends, this is where it happened. The 4 of them, except Amanda, moved forward a few steps, shouting back and forth about where to stop for a break, and Amanda fell behind by just a few seconds to take one more photo. Someone from the group turned around and asked, "Amanda, are you okay?" She nodded. "I'll catch up soon." And then they lost sight of her as they rounded a small bend in the trail. Literally 5 minutes later, they stopped and looked around. Amanda was gone. At first, no one panicked, deciding that she had just lingered behind to find a good angle. But after a couple more minutes, her friends became concerned and went back along the trail, calling, "Amanda, where are you?" There was no answer. They asked other tourists if they had seen the girl with the camera. Someone remembered that she seemed to have passed by, but no one was sure. With each passing moment, they began to feel more and more afraid, because disappearing in broad daylight in good weather on a crowded trail seemed unrealistic. Her friends searched all the nearby bushes and looked in the impassable areas under the rocks, but to no avail. An hour later, they reported it to the ranger at the entrance, and soon the park's security guards were alerted. A large-scale search and rescue operation began, involving volunteers, tourists, and several rangers. The search that day yielded no results. No one saw Amanda leave the trail, no one heard any cries, and nothing suspicious was noticed. The area around Lost Mine is partially open, covered in places with chaparral and low pine trees, with desert plains stretching out below. Stray from the trail, and you encounter rocky terrain and thick thickets of thorny plants. With people on the route, it is usually difficult to hide unnoticed. However, everything suggested that Amanda had vanished into thin air. On the second day, dog handlers joined the search, trying to get the dogs to sniff her jacket, which had been left in the car. According to one ranger, the dogs picked up the scent from the parking lot to the key point on the route where Amanda's friends had last seen her, but soon lost the trail, unable to find a clear direction. Either the scent was lost, or the wind mixed the trails. The weather remained sunny and dry, so weather was not a factor. On the third day, local rescue helicopters were called in. They flew over the Lost Mine area, wooded areas, and rocky cliffs. Amanda was still not found. There were few similar cases on the sheriff's missing persons list, but people did sometimes go missing in the Big Bend, usually during extreme heat and water shortages or during autumn floods. However, there was neither particularly high temperatures nor flooding. By the end of the 5th day, when hope was still alive, something happened that did not add clarity, but only reinforced the aura of mystery. One of the volunteers searching the more distant part of the trail came across a jacket. From the description, it was the same lightweight windbreaker that Amanda had taken with her, just in case, if the wind picked up. The jacket was hanging neatly on a thorny bush, as if someone had deliberately hung it on a branch so that it would be noticed. Based on its location, it was clear that the bush was off the main route, about half a mile from the last place Amanda was seen, but 2 miles away along the trail. Of course, dogs and police had searched that area, but they couldn't figure out how the jacket got there. What's more, search parties had already combed that section of the trail and hadn't seen anything, so could it have been hung there later? And if so, by whom? The next day, another discovery, Amanda's phone. It wasn't a very bulky model by 2001 standards, most likely an early cell phone. It was spotted by a tourist on the trail itself, supposedly lying on the edge where people usually stop before the climb. It was strange that the spot had been checked the day before and no phone had been seen. Was it definitely hers? They checked. There was a sticker on the back that matched the one she had stuck on, and her family recognized it. Again, judging by the condition of the phone, it didn't seem to have been lying in the heat for many days, and it looked almost clean, without a layer of dust or dirt. This added to the sense of unease. It was as if someone had deliberately planted the items, carefully placing them where they would sooner or later be found. There was no explanation as to who could have done this. Friends insisted, "We don't believe Amanda deliberately scattered her belongings to cover her tracks, especially since she had no reason to disappear and torment us." The police began to investigate the theory that an unknown perpetrator had kidnapped Amanda and left her belongings behind as a taunt. But there were no witnesses or motives, and it was a sparsely populated area, albeit with many tourists. No one had noticed any suspicious people or signs of violence. Days passed, then weeks. The girl's parents remained in the Big Bend area, hoping for a miracle, but they found nothing except these 2 items. Unfortunately, the dogs were again unsuccessful. The windbreaker and phone had no fresh scent, and the dogs picked up a confused trail that disappeared after a few feet. By the end of the 3rd week, rescuers officially suspended the search. The result? The girl was never found. No body, no living person, not even a trace indicating her route from the trail. These 3 Texas stories remind us how unpredictable and mysterious nature can be, even in places where it is well known and thoroughly studied. People go out for a routine walk or fishing trip and suddenly disappear without any signs of a struggle or any explainable reason. Their fates remain unsolved mysteries of the Texas parks and swamps, a disturbing reminder that sometimes reality is far more mysterious than any theory. That's all for now, friends. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and comment. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell to be the first to know about new mysterious stories and mysterious disappearances. Take care, be careful, and remember, reality is sometimes much more mysterious than any legend. There are places in Texas where nature keeps its secrets particularly well. The state's national parks, lakes, and canyons are known not only for their beauty, but also for strange disappearances that remain unexplained even years later. Today, we will tell you 3 real stories that happened in different parts of Texas, where people literally disappeared in seconds, leaving behind only inexplicable clues and questions that no one has been able to answer. The first was James Coleman, a young man vacationing with a friend in the Big Ticket Nature Reserve in May 1987. A mysterious pillar of light in the sky and James's subsequent disappearance without a trace continue to spark debate and speculation to this day. Then, there is the story of Tommy and Lisa Green, a young couple who went on vacation to Lake Whitney in June 2004. Their empty boat and unlocked car with the keys in the ignition were all that remained of what was supposed to be a simple getaway in nature. Finally, there is the story of Karen Smith, who disappeared in August 1995 in a matter of moments while hiking on a mountain trail in Guadalupe Mountains National Park, leaving behind only her backpack and the absolute silence that enveloped her friends and rescuers. In May 1987, 22-year-old James Coleman and his friend Patrick went on a short vacation to the Big Thicket National Forest in eastern Texas. The idea was simple: get out of the city for a couple of days, pitch a tent under the trees, and enjoy a leisurely vacation in the heart of the wilderness. The place was famous for its dense forest thickets, unexpected swampy areas, and unique ecosystem. The friends had discussed the trip many times, But it wasn't until early May that they decided the weather was right. Not too muggy yet, and the summer heat hadn't taken over. When they arrived by car at the entrance to the reserve, the sun was already setting. Choosing one of the clearings near the dirt road, where a few tourists usually stopped, the friends found a relatively flat spot for their tent. Everything looked normal. They laid out their gear, checked their sleeping bags and food supplies. Nothing seemed to foreshadow trouble. According to Patrick's recollection, James looked inspired. He loved such outings, especially after intense work in the city. As they were setting up the tent, a strange pillar of light suddenly flashed in the sky, or a bright flash, as if lightning had struck, but there was no thunder. Both friends froze for a moment. The sky was quiet, and as far as they could tell, there were no clouds. "Is that some kind of natural light?" Patrick wondered. James just shrugged, saying that it might be a rare atmospheric phenomenon, and that they should seize the moment. But the glow lasted no more than a minute, then disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. The friends discussed what they had seen for a short time and decided that it was probably an optical illusion, or a rare light effect. They continued to settle in, soon built a small fire, had a modest supper, and went to sleep in the same tent. During the night, Patrick woke up to rustling and noises from the forest, a common occurrence in the local wilderness. James seemed to be sleeping peacefully, but in the early morning before dawn, Patrick discovered that his friend was not in the tent. The sleeping bag was unfolded and empty. He naively hoped. Maybe he went to relieve himself or decided to take a walk to the stream. Patrick called out to James, but there was no answer. He waited until dawn broke and went outside. The place was quiet. There were no traces of where his friend could have gone. Their car was still there. All their equipment was in place, except for some of James's clothes. Patrick searched the nearby bushes. No one was there. He felt as if his friend had stepped out for just a minute but never returned. Agitated and confused, Patrick decided to go to the only forest ranger station he knew of, located at the entrance to the reserve. He walked quickly along the country road. It was about 2 kilometers to the station. There he found the ranger on duty and explained the situation in a confused manner. In 1987, they didn't have cell phones in their pockets, so all emergency calls were made either by radio or through landlines in the forestry office. The ranger quickly raised the alarm, notified the county police, and by noon a team arrived for an initial search. 2 or 3 officers, Patrick, and a couple of local volunteers. According to the participants, everything looked strange at first glance. There were no signs of a struggle or trampled soil. The dogs brought to the scene first picked up James's scent from his belongings left in the tent, but quickly lost it just a few meters from the camp. It was as if the man had taken a few steps and vanished into thin air. One of the first assumptions was, maybe he fell into a shallow swamp or quicksand. However, there were no fresh breaks in the vegetation or signs of submerged feet, and the water nearby was not that deep. Although the forest is capable of concealing things, such a silent disappearance at night, in calm weather, puzzled everyone. Over the next day, the search intensified. They combed the forest square by square, calling out to James and waiting for a response. There was no sound, no alarm signal. James's relatives rushed in from another state, begging them to continue and expand the search radius. But although the area was dense with thickets, it did not look impassable. It seemed that there must be at least a scrap of clothing or a footprint in the damp soil. However, there was nothing. No campfire, no new shelter in the thicket. On the 3rd or 4th day of the search, an unexpected discovery caused everyone to tremble with excitement. A few dozen meters from the camp, in a small thicket, they found James's clothes neatly folded. There were pants, a t-shirt, socks, everything folded almost in a pile, with no visible damage. The strangest thing was that they had searched this area dozens of times during the first few days. How could this pile of clothes have just lain there and gone unnoticed? The rangers and volunteers swore in bewilderment that they had not seen anything like it there, so someone had brought them there later? But why would they undress in the bushes? And where were they now? The dog sniffed at the clothes again, but after a couple of steps, it shook its nose, unable to pick up the scent. It was as if the clothes had been planted there on purpose. Despite this discovery, James was not found that day or the following days. Within a week, the search parties were exhausted. with no results. The organizers of the operation, namely the local police and the Reserve Administration, decided to suspend the large-scale search. There are no new clues. It's pointless to continue. His relatives were in shock. They tried to search the trails on their own and question random tourists, but to no avail. Rumors about the young man's disappearance were rife with speculation. Some talked about a strange glow in the sky, which Patrick remembered. Others hinted at criminals, but there were no signs of a struggle or robbery, and although James's belongings had been found, it was unlikely that a thief would have planted them there. Why would they? Perhaps wild animals had dragged him away, but then his clothes would not have been neatly folded. In the end, nothing else came to light. The Texas newspapers wrote about the mysterious disappearance for a couple of weeks, and Patrick gave several interviews, mentioning the glow from the night before. "We definitely saw a strange pillar of light, but I don't know if it's connected to James's disappearance." The police filed the case as a missing person without suspicion of foul play because there was no evidence of a violent disappearance. James's parents tried everything to get the search reopened, but by the end of the summer of 1987, nothing new had been found in the vicinity of Big Ticket. James Coleman remained on the missing persons list. His body was never found, and there were no signs of his presence in the woods outside the campsite. Patrick returned home and spent the rest of his life haunted by the thought that he could have prevented his son's disappearance if he had woken up on time. Local rangers admitted in private conversations that this was one of the strangest episodes of their careers. No one saw James leave the camp. No one heard any noise. And yet a few days later, his belongings were found neatly arranged in the bushes as if someone had placed them there. So this story, which took place in May 1987 in the Big Ticket Reserve, is still being passed around among tourists and lovers of mysterious disappearances. Some consider it a classic example of the genre. A man disappears, and after a while his belongings turn up, without giving any clue as to where he went. And, as if to mock us, the missing person never reappears. The forest remains silent, and we can only guess what happened that night after the strange light phenomenon that the friends saw in the sky. The police closed the active phase of the investigation long ago, and the parents received no answers, only pain and confusion. Many years later, the case of James Coleman remains open, but without any new leads, and it may well remain one of those mysteries buried in the thick undergrowth and silence of Big Ticket at night. In June 2004, Whitney Lake, located on the border of central Texas, was breathing hot days and moonlit nights. During this season, the shores usually come alive. Families come for picnics, fishermen sit on the piers, and fresh air enthusiasts go boating. This is where 25-year-olds Tommy and Lisa Green went for the weekend, to get away from the city noise and spend a couple of days in the open air. They had been married for only a year and were full of plans and dreams. According to conversations with acquaintances, the couple wanted to spend the night by the lake and rent a boat in the morning to take a trip on the calm water. Neither of them were professional fishermen, but Lisa loved to photograph the lake's expanses, and Tommy was just happy to get away from it all. The next morning, as the heat was just picking up, some tourists driving around the lake noticed a car, an old Toyota sedan, parked not too far from the water. Both doors were wide open and the keys were left in the ignition. This was puzzling in itself. It was unlikely that anyone would voluntarily leave a car in such a condition. When the witnesses approached to check, they suddenly saw a map of the area on the hood. It showed the outline of Whitney Lake and the surrounding roads, and in one place there was a clear cross, as if someone had marked a specific spot on the northern bay or a branch of the lake. Perhaps this indicated the point where Tommy and Lisa intended to go. The random tourists tried to call out to the car's owners but heard no response. There was complete silence, only the breeze rustling the grass and the car doors creaking. It was clear that something was wrong. One couple called the rangers, who arrived around noon, and that was the start of the search for Tommy and Lisa Green. At that point, little was known about the disappearance. Neither friends nor relatives had reported them missing. but the fact that the keys were left in the car with the doors open was already alarming. The rangers and local police officers examined the car and found some personal belongings: a couple of bottles of water, Tommy's wallet with documents, and Lisa's purse, but no money, which she had obviously taken with her. The keys in the ignition suggested that the couple had no intention of leaving for long. Judging by the minimal luggage, they had only planned a short trip. But why didn't they lock the car? Some thought maybe they were going to come back quickly, not fearing theft, since people are constantly coming and going in a tourist area. To clarify the details, an initial search was organized in the evening. A group of volunteers and rangers walked along the lakeshore in both directions, questioning vacationers. No one remembered seeing Tommy and Lisa, at least not a couple matching that description, although the night before several fishermen had mentioned seeing two young people asking about renting a boat. But witnesses were not sure that they were talking about the Greens. What was known was that there was an old pier in that area where boats could occasionally be rented from a private owner. But if Tommy and Lisa did take a boat, why wasn't it listed in the records? Perhaps they had made a private, informal arrangement. The next day brought an even bigger surprise. A mile from where the car was parked, an empty boat was found in the morning, neatly moored to a small ledge on the shore. This seemed even more absurd. The boat looked completely empty, with no life jackets or fishing gear. Inside were just a couple of old blankets, no documents or personal belongings. It seemed as if the owner or owners had simply gone ashore and not returned. The boat was in good condition, with little wear and tear, but it had no number or registration marks, which is sometimes the case with owners of old boats living near the lake. The police decided that Tommy and Lisa might have borrowed it from someone, but even if it was their boat, where were they? Why did they leave it there and not return to their car? Tommy's parents, hearing from acquaintances that his car was abandoned at Whitney Lake, immediately arrived at the scene. They knew that their son had planned to spend the weekend in the countryside with his wife Lisa, but they had no idea that the couple had chosen this particular spot. They had mentioned something about a different campsite. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, the police announced the start of a search and rescue operation. Volunteers, local rangers, and county police were called in. The area was flown over in a rented helicopter, and the lake's shoreline was checked to see if there were any two figures. Local residents were questioned, but no one had seen when or how Tommy and Lisa had arrived, or who they had spoken to, if anyone. The weather was hot, but dry. The water in the lake was warm, and the depth varied from place to place. If they had drowned, why had no one heard any cries or noticed any noise? And the boat was moored, which meant that people could have gotten ashore. Dogs brought in by dog handlers picked up the scent from clothes found in the trunk of the car, but were unable to follow the trail along the shore. The scent was lost after a few dozen meters. The lack of clues in the vast area of the lake made the task difficult. A search by divers also began, but with no one able to indicate the exact location of the dive, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Day after day, the tension grew. The official number of people involved reached several dozen, and the result was zero. No bodies, no signs of violence. The car and an empty boat suggested that the couple had gone for a short boat trip and disappeared. The route was unclear. The theory that they left voluntarily is absurd since the car was still there and their belongings had not been taken. The parents did not believe that their son could have staged his own disappearance. Was it a crime? Had they been kidnapped by someone unknown? But how in broad daylight at a popular lake frequented by fishermen and tourists? And why leave the car with the keys in the ignition and the boat tied to the shore? The search continued for a week, sometimes interrupted due to a lack of new information. The local population eventually realized that this was yet another case of people disappearing near Whitney Lake, where the water can swallow anyone. But if it had been a simple drowning, bodies or some belongings would have surfaced, t-shirts, shoes, etc. The lake is not very deep around its perimeter, and in some places if someone drowns, the body is found within the first few days. But here there was nothing. The police investigation has not yielded any new leads. Lisa's parents also arrived, trying to remember something. It seems that the cross on the map, lying on the hood, was made by Tommy or Lisa. It points to a certain area of the lake, possibly according to rumors, where the fishing is good or the view is beautiful. But then, why was the boat moored a mile away from the car? It is believed that they may have gone into the water closer to the cross to look at something and then, for some unknown reason, did not return. But still, there are no bodies, no conflict, no eyewitness reports. In the end, the official search was suspended and they were both formally listed as missing. Among lovers of mysterious stories, this disappearance was widely discussed. A couple arrives, leaves their car unlocked, a map on the hood, the boat is empty, and the people vanish. Some doubt that the story is true, but the car and boat are real facts from police reports, so something definitely happened. Rumors spread. Some talked about a whirlpool or underwater vortex at the spot marked with a cross, which could have sucked people in silently, but this is usually unrealistic. Others suggested that someone had attacked the couple, taken them away, and simply abandoned the boat, but there was no noise or struggle and no witnesses. In the end, the case of Tom and Lisa Green became one of those stories that people later say they just disappeared in a couple of minutes, leaving their car and boat behind as if nothing had happened. Mystery enthusiasts add that Whitney Lake can be deceptive, with underwater caves, currents, and sometimes strange occurrences rooted in the legends of indigenous tribes. Common sense suggests that the couple must have drowned or gone somewhere, but why were they never found, even years later? No bones or clothing have ever surfaced, and all of their equipment remained in the boat. Located on the western edge of Texas, Guadalupe Mountains National Park attracts travelers with its majestic landscapes, towering ridges, rocky cliffs, and plains that gradually give way to desert. It was to this place that a group of 4 friends set off on August 14, 1995, among them 31-year-old Karen Smith, a woman who had long been in love with mountain trails and was ready to spend any free day in search of new beauty. That Monday, their destination was the Pinnacles Trail, popular with experienced hikers. The trail itself is not difficult, but it still requires a certain level of physical fitness and caution due to the high-altitude climate and sometimes steep drops in elevation. The weather was clear from the morning, and by 10 o'clock the sun was already beating down. The group, led by a trekking enthusiast named Russell, moved along the trail at a moderate pace. They hoped to reach the viewpoint by noon, take a short break, and then return downhill before the evening coolness set in. Karen, as her friends recalled, always walked closer to the middle of the group, sometimes stopping to take pictures of particularly striking views or wipe the sweat from her brow. But that day, everything seemed perfectly normal. No one noticed any signs of illness or anything unusual about her. After climbing one of the longer sections, her friends stopped to catch their breath and drink some water. Karen said something like, "I need to rest in the shade for a minute, then I'll catch up with you," and walked behind a rock formation, where, according to her, it was slightly cooler. As Megan's friend later said, "We were literally a few meters away. We saw her sit down and put her backpack on her knees." The others decided to go a little further, a couple of turns along the trail, to choose a place to rest. Karen asked them not to wait for her. "I'll be right there, just a couple of minutes." Megan turned around after a while, expecting Karen to appear, but there was no one there. It was as if the girl had vanished into thin air in the time it took the group to walk 50 meters along the trail. Hearing no cries or noises, her friends returned to the place where Karen had been sitting, but there was no one there. They walked around whispering her name, calling out to her, but there was no answer. At first they assumed that Karen had simply followed them but stopped a little further up the trail or had gone off to take pictures without telling them. But after searching around for a couple of minutes, they didn't see any traces of her. Soon one of the guys, Lauren, shouted, "Look, it's her backpack!" It was lying just below the trail, as if thrown at the foot of a bush. Inside were water, a wallet, and some personal items. Why did she leave her backpack if she was just going to take a short break? Why didn't she even take any water in the heat? Her friends ran around nervously, thinking she was nearby. After about half an hour of fruitless searching, realizing that she wasn't responding, Megan ran down to where their cars were parked to find the rangers. By noon, the cries and whistles of the rescue team searching for Karen Smith could be heard all along the Pinnacles Trail. The next 2 days saw extensive search and rescue operations in the area around the trail. Although the terrain around the Pinnacles is dry, it is littered with boulders, cliffs, and crevices. The sun was blazing, with temperatures rising to 35 degrees Celsius during the day and dropping at night. If Karen had suffered heat stroke, she needed urgent help. However, the dog handlers who searched the trail and surrounding areas were unable to pick up a clear scent. They picked up a scent at the spot where the backpack was found, but it led in an uncertain direction. The county police, volunteers, and several helicopters were called in to search the area from above. Unfortunately, there was nothing. No rustling, no traces of clothing or broken bushes that would indicate the route of the fall. Karen's parents, who arrived a day later, could not believe that their daughter, always cautious and not prone to risky ventures, could disappear in broad daylight in a matter of minutes. There were no signs that she had fallen or slipped. There were no cliffs nearby, and any cracks had been examined. In addition, other tourists had been walking along the trail that day and had not seen anyone sliding down. No signs of violence or struggle were found. The person disappeared so quickly and silently, it was as if they had stepped into another dimension. After a week of fruitless searches, the rangers suspended the active phase of the search. Karen's relatives refused to give up for a long time, hiring private investigators and distributing flyers. But for about a month, there was no news. By the middle of the summer of 1995, the commotion that had followed the tourist's disappearance had almost died down in Guadalupe Mountains Park, and only her friends and family continued to wonder, where is she? Officially, the case was called Missing Causes and Circumstances Unknown. Some people in the corridors of power called it one of the most inexplicable cases ever. In the presence of a group of friends, on a clearly visible trail, in clear weather, with no signs of a cliff or violent activity, in just a couple of minutes, a girl disappears, and even large search teams cannot find her. What happened in the Texas forests and canyons? Why do people disappear without a trace in a matter of moments, leaving behind only mysterious objects and inexplicable circumstances? If you liked these stories, like them, subscribe to our channel and be sure to click the bell to be the first to know about new, mysterious incidents in Texas and elsewhere. Leave comments with your theories. Maybe you'll find the answers that investigators have been searching for so long. Until next time, take care and stay alert. Hey. Texas is known not only for its endless expanses, unique nature, and hot sun. Sometimes the state becomes the scene of mysterious and inexplicable disappearances that leave many questions and very few answers. Today we continue to tell the stories of people who disappeared right before the eyes of their friends and relatives in well-known and popular places in Texas. October 2004, Big Bend National Park. May 1999, Davis Mountain, and June 1992, Garner Park. What do these cases have in common, other than the fact that people disappeared without a trace? In October 2004, a group of 5 students from the University of Austin decided to spend their vacation in Big Bend National Park, located in southwestern Texas. Known for its majestic canyons, wide desert expanses, and legendary mysterious lights that flicker above the horizon at night, Big Bend often attracts lovers of unusual stories and secluded getaways. The students had long dreamed of spending a few days there, setting up camp, exploring the little-used trails, and of course trying to see for themselves the famous lights that had been the subject of so many rumors. Arriving in 2 cars late in the evening, the guys chose a semi-abandoned parking lot at the foot of a low hill where only a few tourists stopped. The weather was cool, as it was already October and the sun was setting, painting the sky in warm shades. When they set up their tent and lit a modest campfire, one of them, 20-year-old Robert Hayes, said he dreamed of seeing one of those mysterious lights. The others just shrugged. Why would they suddenly appear today? But Robert was burning with enthusiasm. On the very first night, as everyone sat around the campfire chatting leisurely and preparing dinner, a glow suddenly appeared on the top of a nearby hill, like a translucent ball of light, flickering slightly. It instantly caught the attention of the whole group. No one expected the legend to appear so close to them. The light was not very bright, but clear enough to cause general surprise. For a second, everyone sat in silent confusion. Then Robert jumped up, grabbed a flashlight, and commanded, "Guys, I'm going to check what it is." His friends tried to dissuade him. "Wait. Let's go in the morning. It's dark now." But he was too excited. In the end, no one actively tried to stop him. Robert left quickly and disappeared from view behind the nighttime bushes. The other kids, Sarah, Miguel, Joan, and Pete, only saw him climbing upward, heading in the direction of the light. According to Sarah, the fire burned steadily, then flared up and dimmed, and suddenly Robert was at the top. We could see his silhouette illuminated by the moonlight. He stopped, as if looking somewhere to the side. And then the light went out. Perhaps it faded in a split second, and with it, Robert disappeared. His friends could no longer see his shadow or movement. Miguel called out, "Hey Robert, are you okay?" There was no response. Deciding that the guy had just gotten carried away or tripped, they waited a couple of minutes and called again. No one came out from behind the hill. Then they grabbed their flashlights and climbed to the top together. But after a few minutes, they realized he wasn't there. That night, the friends searched the surrounding area. The hill wasn't particularly steep. The top was visible, and there were only small bushes around it. Finding a person who had simply fallen would not have been difficult, but there was no sign of anyone there. They called out again and again, "Robert, answer!" But the only response was silence, interrupted by the night wind. There were no signs of a struggle, no items belonging to the guy on the ground. Everything was clean. Finally, when it became clear that the situation was serious, Miguel went to the car and drove to the nearest ranger station. There aren't many of these stations in Big Bend, but eventually, closer to midnight, 2 park employees arrived at the scene. They searched the area with flashlights, tried to call out to Robert, and asked the guys to describe what they had seen, but to no avail. In the morning, when dawn broke, an additional team of volunteers and rangers was organized in the park to begin a systematic search. For 2 days, people combed the area around the hill, went down to the bed of a dry stream, entered sparse groves, and searched rocky ledges. Big Bend is not as dense as a forest, but rocks and desert areas can hide ravines and crevices. However, there was no sign of Robert Hayes. No footprints, no clothes, no backpack. He had a small backpack that he had put on before climbing. The dogs brought in on the 3rd day ran around nervously, occasionally picking up a scent near the camp, but then losing it at the foot of the hill. What was surprising was that the area around the hill was quite open, hills with relatively sparse vegetation. And if a person had simply been wandering around there, they would probably have been easily spotted from the nearest hills. But it was all in vain. Robert's sister, who arrived a couple of days later from Austin, cried over the unimaginable. How was it possible that in a single minute, a man who had been visible at the top of the hill had disappeared without a trace, without a sound or a commotion? While the rescuers racked their brains, the days passed, and not the slightest clue appeared. Then a week later, local tourists walking 1.5 miles northwest of the camp stumbled upon Robert's diary on the top of a sheer cliff. It was a bound notebook that he often carried with him for notes and sketches. It was amazing that the place where it was found was considered virtually inaccessible without rock climbing skills. Special equipment was needed to climb up there, and there was no official trail leading to it. The diary lay neatly, as if it had been placed there on purpose on a flat ledge. The ledge itself was only a few feet wide. The rangers who arrived at the scene risked climbing up with ropes and confirmed that the diary did indeed belong to the missing man. There were no traces of Robert himself or any other belongings on the ledge. A thorough examination of the notebook revealed no recent entries. The pages appeared to end with notes about travel plans. There were no references to a strange light or anything similar. This discovery further baffled everyone involved in the search. How could the diary have ended up on a hard-to-reach cliff, several miles from the place of disappearance? And most importantly, how could Robert himself have gotten there? Even if he had, he would hardly have left his diary there and gone off somewhere else. Clearly, something completely inexplicable had happened. However, the police filed a dry report. The notebook has been confirmed as belonging to the missing person based on the notes. Its further whereabouts are unknown. No further leads emerged in the investigation. Rumors circulated that someone had deliberately planted the diary, or that Robert himself had left it there as a mark, but nothing in the diary indicated such intentions. The accident theory, although logical, was difficult to take seriously. Why would he climb such a rock, alone and without equipment? There was no evidence to support the crime theory either. No crimes had been reported in the park during that period, and there were no signs of a struggle at the campsite. His friends insisted that he disappeared at the exact moment the lights went out, either a coincidence or something inexplicable. Some mentioned the mystical lights of Big Ben, which, according to local legends, sometimes appear at night and lead people astray. But this happened on the very first evening when the group had not yet had time to settle in. Thus, years later, the disappearance of 20-year-old Robert Hayes in October 2004, and the subsequent strange discovery of his diary on an inaccessible cliff, became one of the local mysteries. His family came to terms with the fact that their son was probably no longer alive, as no news had surfaced. The county police closed the active phase of the investigation, recording him as missing under unknown circumstances. Many questions remained unanswered. Where did the guy disappear to? Who was seen on the summit one second and then the next? How did the diary end up in a place that cannot be reached without climbing skills? And what was the mysterious light above the hill? In May 1999, 35-year-old nature photographer Edward Brooks set out for Davis Mountain, the highest point in Texas, to take some unique pictures of the sunset. Known among landscape photographers for his persistence and talent for finding unusual angles, he loved to work alone. He said that solitude allowed him to focus on nature. Those who knew him were not surprised by his desire to go there alone. Although the Davis Mountains are not known for being extremely dangerous, they do require caution due to steep climbs and gusty winds. Edward himself planned to take a series of photographs of the sunset sky, spend the night in a camp at the foot of the mountain, and return to civilization the next day. Judging by the notes in his notebook, which were later found in his car, Edward planned to climb to the summit during the day, catch the golden hour of the evening sun, and descend before nightfall. The weather that day was clear, relatively warm, with no storm warnings. Everything looked safe. No one expected any trouble, as he had been to the Davis Mountains before and knew the trails. When he did not return to his car in the parking lot on Sunday, May 16th, volunteer friends who were also in the mountain area became concerned. Edward's belongings were in the trunk, a supply of food, warm clothes. He had taken only his main camera equipment and a light backpack. Climbing the trail to the summit, the volunteers did not find him along the way or at key vantage points. On the way, they met other tourists who remembered seeing a lonely man with a large camera closer to lunchtime. He was walking briskly and greeting people politely. No one noticed any signs of distress or problems. By evening, rangers arrived at the site and began sending out requests via radio to other tourists. "Has anyone seen a photographer with a backpack?" Nothing. The next morning, the search operation was expanded. Several groups searched the intermediate stops and trails, and dog handlers were called in, but the dogs were unable to pick up his trail near the summit. Perhaps the wind and rocky ground had left no scent. The area around Mount Davis is fairly open with rocky cliffs but also some gentle slopes. The rangers said, "If he slipped and fell, we would have found clues, pieces of clothing, the camera must have broken, something," but the search yielded nothing. On the second day of the search, as the helicopter circled the summit, the pilot noticed something shiny in the distance at the very edge of the stone plateau. A couple of rescuers landed and examined the spot. It turned out to be a backpack and a camera lying on a flat ledge next to a small crevice, but there was no sign of Edward, his clothes, or any traces of a struggle or blood. Inside the backpack were additional lenses, spare film, a notebook with brief notes on light and exposure, but no mention of what might have happened. It seemed as if Edward himself had laid the items out neatly, or if they had been carefully arranged. The lens cap lay on a rock nearby, as if it had been removed in a hurry. The camera found next to the backpack contained a roll of film. More precisely, it was on the last frame, the empty film already rewound. In the dark room where the rescuers took the camera, they carefully removed the film. Amazingly, all the previous frames captured fragmentary views of Mount Davis, breathtaking landscapes, sunset, a deserted plain below, but the last frame showed an almost unrecognizable, frightened look. It was Edward's face, as if he had turned the camera around and pressed the shutter. And at that moment, the frame came out blurred, but his wide eyes and contorted fear were clearly visible, plus something vague behind him out of focus. It looked as if he was trying to capture something behind him, but in the end, the lens captured him in motion. Neither the cause of the fear nor anything specific behind him could be discerned, only blurred outlines resembling rock ledges or shadows. This discovery clearly suggested that something had happened to him at the last moment. The police could not say anything more. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, no torn clothing. There were no notes on the rock ledge indicating where he might have gone. The search continued in the following days, with the area around the summit and crevices being thoroughly searched. Divers even checked nearby bodies of water, although there was little chance that he had fallen in, all to no avail. The wind and sun quickly erased any possible clues, and the terrain could have hidden small crevices in the steep cliffs. Rangers talking to journalists said that this was one of the strangest episodes. Usually, if a person falls, there are traces of the fall, some fragments of equipment, blood, and sooner or later the body is found. But here, the summit of Davis Mountain is quite popular, and after a week of searching, nothing but the camera surfaced. Edward's relatives were shocked when they learned about the last photo. His face remained on the negative. The police said that it was impossible to determine what caused the fear, and it was unclear whether there was someone or something standing there. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Upon careful examination of the negatives, experts noticed that the blurred background could have been a shadow from a rock or a cloud. It was difficult to say. Some members of the community, fascinated by the topic of mystical disappearances, cited this photograph as an example of a ghostly or anomalous phenomenon. But rational researchers pointed out that Edward could have simply stumbled, been frightened by a snake or the wind, accidentally pressed the shutter button, and fallen down. However, in more than 25 years, the body has not been found. In short, the outcome was sad. Edward Brooks never returned, and the presumed cause of his disappearance has not been established. The case was officially classified as missing under unclear circumstances with no suspicion of foul play. To those around him, it seemed strange. He was an experienced hiker, knew the Davis Mountains well, had made many trips to other parks, and was not known for recklessness. If he had fallen, it would probably have been possible to trace his fall, and if he had gone and got lost, he could have sent a signal. But everything indicates that it was at the summit that he encountered something that caused him sudden terror, and then he disappeared. Richard Holt, a 27-year-old resident of San Antonio, went to Garner State Park on June 11, 1992, with two friends, Tom and Greg. The park is known in Texas for its picturesque hills, oak and cedar forests, and the clear Rio Frio River, which winds through winding canyons. On that day, the group planned an easy hike to get away from the city noise and enjoy the summer scenery. According to Tom, the weather was absolutely clear with no sign of rain, and the temperature was around 86 degrees Fahrenheit. They arrived early in the morning, left their car in the parking lot at the entrance, and set off on the official trail that runs along the creek, where people usually stop to admire the water or take a dip. By noon, a little tired from climbing the rocky hills, the friends decided to take a break by the creek flowing through the rocky bed. The landscape was magnificent: hills, cedar thickets, and a rocky ridge rising nearby, which tourists love to photograph. Richard took out some sandwiches and suggested they have a snack, then said he would like to go and look at that rock up there. Greg asked if he was too tired, but Richard just smiled. "I'm fine. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. I'll take a couple of pictures." When Richard had walked a few hundred feet up the trail, Tom and Greg stayed below, finishing their sandwiches and enjoying the view of the water rushing over the shallow rapids. Suddenly they heard a strange sound. Greg described it as a muffled cry, or perhaps a call coming from the direction Richard had gone. The sound was quick and sharp, followed by a deathly silence. Both friends became alarmed, suspecting that Richard might have fallen or suddenly been frightened by something. They called out his name, but there was no answer. Disturbed, the friends left their backpacks and followed the trail upward. Surprisingly, after a short climb of a few minutes, they couldn't find Richard. The trail ran along a slightly elevated slope without dense forest, and the area seemed relatively open. Practically a view in all directions, nowhere to hide, Greg recalled later. However, they saw no one, no signs of a struggle, nothing. Climbing up to the rock that Richard wanted to see, they called out again and walked a little further behind the ledge. Nothing. It seemed there was nowhere to disappear. There was no steep cliff to fall off, and the river remained below. At first, his friends thought he was joking, hiding behind a bush, but 10 minutes passed, then 15. Nothing. Realizing that this was no joke, Tom and Greg climbed back down to the stream where they had left their backpacks, hoping that Richard had returned, but he wasn't there. They hurried to the nearest area where they had seen other tourists and asked for help. At around 3 p.m. that same day, an alarm was raised in the park. One of the rangers arrived at the scene, listened to the story, and invited a group of volunteers to conduct an initial search of the area. What could have happened in the middle of a clear, bright day, especially in an open area? Everything pointed to Richard disappearing from view in literally a minute. By evening, sheriff's deputies arrived to officially report the disappearance. A crowd of nearly 24 people gathered, park employees, volunteers, tourists. They split into groups and searched the ridge, the same rocky outcrops and bushes. Soon, a couple of dog handlers with dogs were called to the scene, but they were unable to arrive until nightfall. But there were no results. The dogs sniffed Richard's scent on his belongings in the car, followed the trail to where the men had eaten lunch, picked up the scent on the trail, and, according to the dog handlers, lost it literally 7,100 feet after the ascent. It was as if he had vanished at the point where he was last seen. In the days that followed, the search operation expanded. Even a small group of rescuers with a helicopter joined in, flying over the peaks and ravines. Garner is a fairly popular park, and such a disappearance caused quite a stir among the locals. It seemed that all they had to do was look closely at the slope, and they would find some kind of trace, clothing, a camera, or signs that he had slipped. But nothing was found. Days passed and the heat remained. Experts said that if Richard had lost consciousness somewhere, sooner or later he would be found, or he would respond to cries for help. But there was no response. On the 5th day of the search, when the enthusiasm of the participants was waning, only a couple of oddities were discovered. One tourist, who was walking in a remote part of the park at the time, claimed to have seen a man resembling Richard, dressed in a white t-shirt and dark shorts, walking down a rocky ravine closer to sunset on the first day of his disappearance. But this witness could not clearly identify the man's face. The area where he allegedly saw the figure was searched, but again, without result. No one else reported anything similar. A week later, the authorities officially announced that they saw no prospects for a large-scale search. The chances of finding Richard alive were dwindling with each passing day. Friends and relatives continued their private search for some time, but to no avail. No clothing, no backpack, no map, no wallet. It was as if everything he had with him had been left in the car. The police questioned Tom and Greg about possible conflicts, wondering if Richard had a reason to disappear. Both swore that he loved life and had no debts. He had simply walked away to look at the cliff and disappeared. Many years have passed since then. For the local police, this is one of those unsolved cases where a missing person apparently disappeared in open terrain on a clear day, and no reasonable explanation has been found. In the end, the official reports were closed with the wording, Missing, cause unknown. According to rangers, neither wolves nor cougars attack people in that area. However, large predators often leave clues behind. Scraps of clothing, blood. Was it a crime? No one saw any suspicious individuals. He couldn't have fallen into a ravine. There are no deep cliffs there. His relatives continue to live without a body to bury, and without knowing what happened on June 11, 1992, on the sunny slope of the Pinnacles Trail. All three cases remain unsolved. The police, rescue workers, and families of the missing have been trying to find answers for many years, but to no avail. Could these incidents be just tragic coincidences, or is there something more to them? What really happened to Robert, Edward, and Richard in places where it would seem impossible to disappear? If you enjoyed these stories, be sure to like, subscribe to the channel, and share your theories in the comments. Perhaps your guess will help solve these mysterious disappearances. Thank you for joining us. Take care and be careful when venturing into the wild corners of our amazing and sometimes mysterious world.